Welcome to another edition of the Beatlemaniacs. With Seth Lerman and our special guest, brand new Beatlemaniac, Ryan Whittier, who just graduated from college. Congratulations, Ryan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And Ryan is quite a Beatles expert, as we are, or claim to be. And we're going to do what's our subject for today, Seth?
The Beatles Breakup.
The Beatles Breakup. Many opinions, many stories, many books have been written about this. So let's get into it. Seth, you lead us off, please.
Well, this discussion came about, Leonard, if you remember, a few months back, where an article came out saying that it was Paul McCartney that was really the one that was responsible for the Beatles breakup, and Paul's rewriting of Beatle history has pointed the finger to John Lennon. And we discussed it briefly then. And I actually read that article, and I went back to the books and interviews. In fact, I was looking at one today that George conducted. And I think that the original statement of John was the one that broke up the Beatles was the true statement. And Lennon remembers, Lennon said he had enough. And that was the Rolling Stone interviews done by Jan Wenner right after the Beatles broke up. And Lennon said that he had enough. He wanted out. He left the band, told the others that he was leaving. Abbey Road was not yet mixed or finished. Paul, Ringo, and George went in early in 1970 and did the final trackings of the Abbey Road album, the overdubs and whatnot. And then everything started with the Alan Klein situation, where they all wanted to sign with Klein, that thing that was going on for many years. The Apple, the Phil Spector doing the Let It Be sessions, remixing the songs, adding all the classical music. The McCartney solo album coming out, and Paul ultimately suing the other three. And there's the two part of it, was what I was going to get to. Lennon left the band at the end of 1969. Paul sued the other three in 1970, and that stayed in courts for a number of years. The final dissolution of the group was in 1974, where they all signed the paperwork saying the Beatles are now officially dissolved. The Beatles were already done. Lennon left the band. Harrison wanted out as well, and we saw that in the Get Back film where he walked out and stayed away for about 10 days. But in the interview I saw today with Harrison, he said that John Lennon and Paul misread him. They weren't giving him the chance to step into his writing shoes. And we saw that happen. We've heard about it. We've read about it. I think Harrison had enough as well, and he wanted to play with other musicians. He wanted to be a musician, and he said many times that being in the Beatles prevented him from doing that. Lennon was the one that left. Harrison had no problem with the group disbanding either. Ringo was going to go along with whatever went along with. Paul sued them, but Paul wanted the band to continue because right up until the moment that Lennon left, in the Lennon Remembers book, Lennon said Paul kept pushing him, let's go back on the road and play small clubs. And Lennon said, we're not going to do that. In fact, I'm quitting the band. I'm done. I haven't read anything, I haven't seen anything that disproves that.
I went through that all with you. You're like an encyclopedia, Seth. That's awesome. I really, there's so many factors in the background of all that. Like there's Yoko being in the studio and the Alan Klein thing. And Paul wanted his own in-laws to be their manager to take Brian Epstein's place. And George's resentment of Paul. And it's kind of a toss-up. I think everything you said, Seth, is a perfect timeline. I think the big question is, what were the big factors that made all that stuff happen?
To add to this, one of the big factors obviously was George. I mean, just from 66 onward, starting with Revolver, probably going even back to Rubber Soul, when he really started writing when he started writing more and whatnot, and he grew as a songwriter, but he wasn't being taken seriously. Um, I think he wanted to get away from that. Um, in fact, oh God, I'm trying to remember. I think he wanted to get away from it as early as like 1966, at the end of their 66 tour, when like after the Candlestick Park performance, you know. But just to George in general, becoming a better song and a better musician in general. I think he wanted to express himself a lot more, but the power that was McCartney and Lennon just won't allow him to really do that. What with them only having one or two Lennon songs per album and whatnot.
That's a very interesting point. And I remember hearing John say and read that he thought the band was splitting up as early as 1967 when the trip to India took place that was initiated by George. George and John stayed in India 4 months. Ringo left after 30 days and Paul left after 2 months. He believed that the band was splitting up then. And history recalls when they came back to London to record the White Album, that was, in all four opinions, four solo albums put together as one. Everybody, there was no collaboration. This is John's song. I want it done this way. Paul wanted his songs done this way. George had While My Guitar Gently Weeps, was probably his first great song, was on that album. And it was a very, very tense filled album. In fact, Ringo left for a week during the middle of it. He felt like the other three were connected and he wasn't. And the other three were saying the same thing. We thought it was us three. It was a very difficult period. And I think you're probably correct. It started at the end of the tour. George is a musician. If you're not going to tour and he's going to get his one song per album, it's going to take him how many albums, Leonard, to reach? How many Beatle albums would to release all of Harrison's songs?
Uh, they 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 never release all of Harrison's songs. If you go onto YouTube, you can see early versions of All Things Must Pass, uh,
Which they did reject.
and they rejected that.
They did not like that. John and Paul did not like All Things Must Pass, the song, actually, not the album.
Yeah,
And
but
it's a beautiful George song.
Maybe it wasn't that they didn't like the song. They didn't like the way that it was coming out. It didn't sound Beatley enough, maybe. I don't know. It's it could be a confusing jumble of facts, but George definitely has a bigger role in the breakup than I think we knew in the past because of all the stuff that's been coming out. George did an interview where he said that Paul McCartney ruined him as a musician, as a guitarist. And I keep seeing that popping up on my feed because I subscribe to all these Beatle channels, you know. Um, and George, I think, had a lot of pent up anger because he was still seen as a little kid by John and Paul because he was the youngest of all of them. If you remember, he got thrown out of Germany because he was underage after the Beatles lit a fire in their little apartment in Hamburg. And I guess he and Pete Best had to leave, and it was only John left. Paul left too, but John at one point was the only one left in Germany, and he was the last one to come back. But George was the first to have to
Yeah.
leave because he was so young.
He was 9 months. Well, he would have still been 9 months younger than Paul,
Yes,
but a year and a half, or almost 3 years younger than John.
exactly.
And they've referenced that. Paul has referenced that George was younger. And at 14 and a half and at 16, that's a big difference between the two.
He refers to
Yes, it
George
is.
as his baby brother in one of the
Mhm.
last interviews. Right after George died, he was quoted as saying that, you know. So it's really interesting that during the 70s, Paul and George were probably the only Beatles besides John and Paul that didn't get together musically, you know. But
Mhm.
they did see each other socially later on. In fact, on Back to the Egg, Paul refers to George in lyrics. So glad to see you. is a song where George visited Paul, I guess, in the recording studio, and Paul
Oh, I
just
never
said
knew
in the
that.
lyrics, so glad to see you here, so glad you could come, so glad to see you here, carry on, carry on. That was directed to George. The point that I was trying to make earlier is that Paul and George resolved their personal differences during the 70s, but the musical differences and the hierarchy within the band was not solved. And that's why George didn't really work with Paul until after John was killed. And he contributed some, he had Paul contribute to his album
For John.
for John, yes.
There's one instance that I can recall reading about, and it stems off of a photo that surfaced, I don't know, maybe a year or 2 years ago or something like that. It's from, I believe, late '79, and it's Paul and George playing on stage at, I believe, Eric Clapton's wedding
Mhm.
or
Yes,
something like that.
yes.
And I believe that's like the extent of what they will have done together, like
Well,
pre Lennon's death.
so before Lennon's death, John and George and Ringo worked on the Ringo album. John contributed, all the Beatles contributed to
Mhm.
that album, but the closest that they came to a full reunion was John, George, and Ringo on "I Am the Greatest," John's composition. And then what you're talking about is at Eric Clapton's wedding, John couldn't go to England to Eric Clapton's wedding because of his immigration status. He would have been, they would have kept him there. They would have kept him out of the U.S. He wouldn't have been able to go back to the Dakota if he had shown up there. But plus, he claimed he didn't get an invitation, right, Seth?
I heard something like that. I don't think he would have gone anyways. That was during Sean was 4 years old. He wasn't leaving New York. He wasn't going anywhere with his. I don't think his it wasn't a hermit existence, but it was out of a spotlight existence.
So
And
let's go back to the main question. What do you think the main factor, if or a main factor, was in the Beatles breakup? And I think, and I'm not saying this meanly, I think a lot of it had to do with Yoko because she was the first one that there was a problem within the hierarchy of the band. Before she showed up, the only people who were in the studio were George Martin, possibly guest musicians like Billy Preston or Eric Clapton. Once in a while, maybe a girlfriend would pop in and out, but no one would be sitting in the studio like Yoko did. And that caused many unspoken resentments from George and Paul toward the situation. Paul seemed to have solved it within himself, and he told himself, is what he says now. He told himself, John has a right to be happy, so we should accept him having her. But what I think is a big factor is they could not, this was brought out on a little documentary. I can't remember where I saw it, that British people, it has to do with British people. The British culture is one that in public settings you did not discuss personal problems directly. So George and Paul did not really say, "Hey, John, what are you doing?" It's really not good to have another person who's not participating in the music to be here in the studio. They never said that stuff. It went on and it got worse because it was bubbling up underneath. So by the time it came out in the open, it came out very badly. Uh, I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
I think that history has shown or history has told us that it's easy to blame an outsider such as Yoko
Mm-hmm.
rather than look at what was going on with inside the band. And I think Yoko unfairly has taken a lot of criticism over the Beatles breakup. I, for one, believe that if John wasn't, if he couldn't bring her and they did say something, he wasn't going to go to those sessions.
Yeah.
He wanted to be with Yoko. Didn't want to be with the Beatles. Beatles were very tough for him to get away from. He talked about it in that book, Leonard Remembers, he talked about it in the Playboy interviews right before his murder in 1980, that they were closeted in the Beatles. They couldn't branch out. It was the four of them. They couldn't branch out. And the pressure had to be enormous within that band, had to be enormous that every time they went into the studio, they had to come up with a masterpiece. And I think that can only last us so long with the stress building up, the stress building up. I
Yeah.
think that, again, I say if Yoko wasn't there, John wasn't going to be there. And that was the outlet he needed. He needed to be with another creative artist. He had Paul. For him to leave, he had to have someone else with him. He wasn't a guy that liked to be on his own. And you know, when Yoko left him and sent him with May Pang, and he ended up with Ringo and Harry Nilsson partying in LA, there was always a group that he had to be with. He wasn't one that was a loner to do it on his own. I
Yeah.
think that Yoko might have been. It's easy to blame Yoko rather than look at the four people everybody loved not getting along for a period of time. But that's bound to happen when you're together that much.
Right. So when I said that, I mean, she was the first. Didn't mean to blame Yoko,
No, I didn't think you were.
but yeah. So I just want to make that clear to whoever's watching. I wasn't blaming Yoko and casting her as a villain. I was just saying that she was the first to kind of penetrate that insular group. And that didn't help matters because all of that other stuff was going on all the time. George had a great idea when he brought Eric Clapton in to do the solo for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That put John and Paul on their best behavior. The same thing he tried with Billy Preston, bringing him in. Again, they were on their best behavior. You're not going to air your dirty laundry. If they couldn't open up to each other directly, they weren't going to do it in front of an outsider in the group.
Here's a question for Ryan and for you, Leonard. I look at the Beatles breakup that the seed was laid when Brian Epstein died. What do you think of that?
I completely agree. I completely agree because post Brian Epstein, they didn't have any direction to go off of because Brian was just so rigid in those early years for the Beatles. Like that was their foundation. And then when their foundation dies, like immediately after Pepper, you know, just after what can arguably be considered as their height of creativity during the psychedelic era of 1967, it's like just it's just a big blow towards their unit to the point where they don't know what to do. And if you don't have that one thing where you can fully connect to, such as Brian Epstein, then like it doesn't bode very well. And I think history has really shown that,
I
especially
agree.
with the White Album sessions.
I agree. See, now that also opened up the door for somebody had to step in as a leader, and that's when Paul probably asserted too much authority in some aspects, but in another way, he was responsible for the Beatles even recording 4 more albums or whatever the number was. Without him saying, "Hey guys, let's go in the studio," they would have just sat by the pool, as Ringo has told over and over again. And on his, he's been doing a lot of interviews lately, and he said that very thing. I don't want to talk too much about this, but living the Beatles legend, the untold story of Mal Evans. Mal Evans was saying in the book that Brian Epstein was very much an authoritarian figure, not only for the Beatles, but for the people who work for the Beatles, such as himself and Neil Aspinall. He yelled at Mal Evans a couple of times, and Mal was always very wary of him. So that's kind of interesting that he held that sort of power, which is power that he probably lost after Candlestick Park, because when they didn't tour anymore, they didn't have anything for Brian Epstein to do. No clothing to be arranged or presentations or billboards or anything like that to promote the concerts or anything like that. Sorry, guys, my phone came on by itself. All right.
I think, like I said, Leonard, there's a lot of factors, but we know Lennon left. And what I really believe was part two of that is when McCartney filed a lawsuit to dissolve the partnership. And I think that prevented any reunion from ever taking place. Because even after Lennon left, Harrison played on the first two Lennon solo albums. They
Yeah.
all contributed with Ringo. Paul became the outsider of the other three when he sued to dissolve that partnership.
But
And that
within
wasn't settled for many, many years. In 74, they signed the paperwork, but it went on for many years, that bitterness.
now Jack Douglas, who produced Milk and Honey and Double Fantasy, claimed after John died that John had definite plans to record with Paul in 1981. Whether that's would have happened or not, but their issues, you're right, Seth, that the issues, legal issues like that kept them apart for many years.
Yeah, that
Uh,
prevented them from uniting.
mhm.
But Lennon saying that I'm done because Harrison, Ringo, Paul all did finish the Abbey Road overdubs on their own in early 1970. Lennon was not in the studios. And there's plenty of pictures that show Harrison and McCartney singing together. George with his hair already at the Almost Things past cover length.
Yeah, yeah. And in from May Pang's book, when John and Paul did get together in 1974, they just sat around getting drunk with all the other people. And Mal Evans actually took the picture that you see both of them on chase lounges and Paul with the mustache. And probably, in addition to them being probably not in the best frame of mind to do any composing or work, uh, probably some of those legal issues were probably preventing them from actually doing something productive together as well, because who would own what they did, and who, you know what I mean? It could have been a legal quagmire if they did something before everything was legally all sorted out. So yeah, it's so sad. It's so tantalizing to think what they would have done, what they would have been able to do if they recorded together again, if they composed together again.
The one thing that's interesting, if that was today, they make a big deal out of Lennon going 5 years between albums. He did
Yeah,
that rock and roll album, then nothing for 5 years until
yeah,
Double Fantasy. And today that wouldn't be thought of as being a that would be normal today. They have bands that make
yeah,
an album maybe 6, 7 years today. They're not producing 2, 3 albums per year anymore.
yeah.
Um, the Beatles never did solo albums other than the electronic sound and some of the avant-garde stuff. That if they did take a break and Harrison did his solo stuff and Ringo put out his Sentimental Journey, which the Beatles were still together actually when they did that, uh, maybe things would have been different. A
Yeah.
break from each other might have been nice, but it wasn't going to happen during that time period.
Going back to when John announced, I want a divorce and I don't want to come back to the group anymore. Uh, I was reading that George and Paul and Ringo really didn't know,
Yeah,
because
they
of
don't
John's
do
personality. They didn't know if he meant that or if he would be back in a week.
it. Mm-hmm.
So that's another
Oh,
factor.
absolutely.
It could have gone either way, I think, at that point.
So if we're talking about the Beatles breakup, then you have got to talk about Get Back, mainly because Get Back has all the visual and audio representation of the Beatles in the midst of what would eventually become the breakup.
That's true. That's true. I think that I want to go back to an earlier part of the discussion that we were having about how the tensions were so high during Let It Be and Abbey Road, but the music did not suffer. That's the whole thing. The music never suffered, no matter what they were going through, no matter what their issues with each other. When they got into the studio, they still enhanced each other's songs, even on the White Album, which it said that they were very separate. They didn't do the group harmonies as much. They didn't do a song like Because as they did on Abbey Road or This Boy or things like that. But when they would play with each take, if you listen to early takes of a lot of these songs or most of these songs, you can find on on YouTube, everything got better and better with each take and changed so much. And I think the best example of this is the song Two of Us. And Two of Us was written by mostly Paul, and it says that he wrote the whole thing. If you listen to early takes of Two of Us, it was a rock song. It was electric guitar, and it just didn't set right, you know? And I don't know if Paul was alone that he wouldn't have left it like that. But somewhere along the line, along take 10 or 12 or whatever it was, they changed to acoustic, and it worked really, really well. So well that to me, it sounded like a Simon and Garfunkel song, that kind of style, you know, that folksy. That's the thing. They could switch genres very, very easily and fluidly, even changing one song that was a rock song into an acoustic song. So my point is their collaboration, even when it wasn't directly into the compositions, was important in the studio. Otherwise, as I always say, why doesn't it sound like this on their solo albums? Why do the solo albums sound so plain, at least to me?
Well, go back to the Get Back. It's interesting because we have two versions. Leonard, I don't know if you were fortunate as I was. I saw the original Let It Be film in Boston in the 70s.
I did.
Just
Yes.
took the train in there, and then we got to see the Get Back version
Yeah.
4 years ago, and of course we're exposed to a lot more now. Michael Lindsay Hogg recently did an interview where he's talking about they restored the original Let It Be film and it's being released again, his version of it. And he said when he showed that to when they had the premiere and the other Beatles were there that night, all of them were there for the premiere, and he wondered how that was going to work with all four of them sitting there with everything they went through, and he said they looked at it and they were fine with it because them in the studio, they argued, they bickered. A lot of that took place, but the cameras weren't rolling like they did for the Get Back. You know, those cameras weren't there when George and Paul had that argument with Hey Jude that we heard about in Get Back,
Right.
or some of the other issues that have happened in the past when they've had disagreements. That was the first time that we, as fans, were invited inside the Beatles studio, as much as Yoko or Linda or Patty were in there. We were able to see the Beatles working together for the first time. We were never exposed to that. We didn't get to see them films of them making Rubber Soul or Revolver or Please Please Me. So our perception might be a little bit different than what they've gone through, where they say, "Oh my God, look at that, Jordan. George is walking out. Paul and John are not getting along. Ringo looks bored." That could have happened many times in the past that these arguments took place. We were not exposed to that. I think the George issue was we talked earlier today, very serious that he walked out. He had enough. It took him 10 days. John didn't show up the next day. If you remember that scene with Paul crying, saying, now there's only two of us.
Yeah.
There's now poignant in many other ways because it's still only those two. It was the first time that we got to see the problems within the band as a public.
It shows that the power of a director and an editor, Michael Lindsay Hogg versus Peter Jackson. Michael Lindsay Hogg, it seems to me that he sought to, he went looking for all of the arguments and put them together to make a dramatic movie. Now that, in my opinion, influenced the history of the band after they broke up, because Paul McCartney himself said in a couple of interviews that he was starting to believe himself that it was all acrimony and all bitterness. And when he watched Get Back, it kind of liberated him because Peter Jackson's version showed all the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, editing is a big, big thing. It can change history, you know, I always say this when I used to teach editing in my video classes. If you have 5 editors with the same footage and they don't know what the other ones are doing, every one of them will be different. Everyone will have a different view. They'll pick different takes and all that stuff. What's your opinion, Ryan?
Let's see. My opinion on the whole thing is that it's especially with with all the Get Back footage that was officially released, like what, 4 years ago at this point or something like that, it puts into context really of the original Let It Be movie and whatnot. It shows, yeah, it shows the happy moments, but it shows the ups and downs of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And honestly, it really does rewrite history, what you were saying about McCartney. But I also believe that if George was still alive and he saw that, it would have changed his mind about it as well. Because I remember during, I believe, Anthology, where George has had a completely negative thought on Let It Be in general because of that movie.
Right.
And just seeing all the alternate footage and seeing them happy and collaborating together, just it puts a new perspective on the whole thing, I think.
That's very true. That's very true. Now, there's a legend that goes around about I don't know if it was during the filming of Get Back, Let It Be, or if it was at a different period, but there's a thing going around that says John and George had a fist fight, a physical fist fight. I don't know. Have you either of you heard about that
Yeah, I've
before?
heard
I
it, but
bel Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty
Do you
sure
think
I
it
heard.
happened?
In fact, um, honestly, I'm not too sure about it. I'm trying to remember back, but I think they actually referenced that in Get Back. I think they actually did, but
Really? I don't remember that. Huh. That's the
I
thing
mean, who
about Get
knows?
Back. It's so long, and there's moments that a lot of people are going to see that a lot of people aren't going to see because it's so long. It's hard to pay attention, even if you're a diehard Beatlemaniac. Hard to pay attention. At certain points, you're going to nod off. It's hard to watch something like that all the way through. It's how many hours was it?
10 hours.
Like 8 hours
Yeah,
long
it's
or
like
something like that.
crazy long. You got to really take it bit by bit, which is why I appreciate a lot what YouTube people have done is they zeroed in on what they noticed, and you'll see maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes at the most of something that they saw that, oh, I didn't notice that because it's highlighted in that particular video now. I mean, we're not going to solve anything here with how the breakup happened, but I think we did a really good review of what went on and some of the causes of it.
I'm trying to remember the writer's name. It was recently that said when George Harrison passed away, the truth behind the Beatles was lost.
Hmm.
Because he said Paul rewrites history, John was dead, and Ringo didn't know. But George, but George could be very cynical and sarcastic at times, depending on what day you talk to him.
Yeah.
And so could Lennon.
That's
Lennon could be very bitter towards the Beatles and then very fun. I don't know if you saw the comment last week. Olivia Harrison was asked, had the Beatles, had George not passed and had John not passed, would George have joined a reunion if it did happen?
Yeah.
And Olivia said, yes, he would have. He loved the other three. He would have done it. I
Well,
think I think they would have.
she could have said that as a public relations thing to make George look good, you know, but he did prove that if he needed the money, he would do it because he did it with Paul and Ringo during the 90s, for the anthology. He had no
And
choice. He was broke. He was bankrupt.
but if you look at the videos of that, he was having fun with them. He was enjoying there. There was a lot of laughter. And I just saw they released a new video of Real Love. It was a little bit long, about 20 minutes of them making Real Love. I saw today.
In parts of it, he appeared that way, but I saw he was making sour faces throughout a lot of it. You want to wrap this up, guys?
Let's wrap it up. Yep.
sure.
So that was a pretty good discussion. Hopefully, on the next show, we will discuss Living the Beatles Legend about Mal Evans by Kenneth Womack. See, I had to look over there to see the author's name, even though I spent weeks reading the book. Um, it's quite a read, and when we all read it, I think we'll all get something a little bit different out of it. So, anyway, we're gonna say so long, and any last words, guys?
No, I just want to welcome right into the group.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on here.
And we'll hope to have you again the next time we do it. Until then, I'm Leonard Caplan.
I'm Seth Lerman.
And I'm Ryan Whittier.
And we are
The
the
Beatlemaniacs.
Beatlemaniacs.